10 years it took to build at a cost of more than £500 million, all to guard against what was prophesied to be a knockout blow to the nerve centre of the country. London now has got a flood defence like no other in the world, built to withstand the kind of freak tide which might happen only once in 1,000 years. As much as 45 square miles of this city stood at risk. Nearly 300,000 homes could have been made unfit to live in. Think of it, no gas, no electricity, more than 300 schools and dozens of hospitals closed, Parliament awash, museums and art treasures ruined. And London's underground system too, the rail system, swamped, probably out of action for as much as 6 months. And the bill for all that, well, it could have come to about £4 billion. So, this afternoon, everyone is marking an achievement that's nothing less than the rescue of our capital city from catastrophe. Waiting at the barrier now is our reporter, John Andrew. John.
It's almost 1,800 feet from one end of the barrier in Greenwich to the other end in Newham. That's about a third of a mile, twice as long as the Houses of Parliament. The 9 concrete piers stand 145 feet from the foundations, deep in the river, to the top of those steel-clad domes, almost as high as Nelson on his column in Trafalgar Square. And the piers are 214 feet long as 8 double-decker buses parked end to end. The 4 main gates each weigh 3,200 tons, and when the gates are in the defence position, they're 70 feet tall, 15 feet higher than Marble Arch. And as for all the concrete they used, well, we're told it took 500,000 tons to build the piers and the sills, enough to fill Wembley Stadium.
So, that's the size of it, and Londoners are responding, despite this chilly wind. I can tell you it's a day for thermals out on the river, and if it's cold up here, it'll certainly be cold down at the barrier. There you can see the Royal Nore, which is all moored up, waiting for Her Majesty, and the men in the red coats on the left, well, they're the Royal Watermen. Music sounding, so let's go and join Steve Clark.
And here comes the royal car now. A fanfare's just blown up, and the car making its way onto the ramp, come onto the embankment. And the car pulling around in front of the festival pier, where the first people are going to be presented to Her Majesty are lining up, ready to meet her. First of all, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen are greeted by Harvey Hines. Harvey Hines, the chairman of the GLC, meeting the Queen for the first time and welcoming Her Majesty and Prince Philip formally on behalf of all Londoners. A wave to the crowd, that's what they've been waiting for. And first of all, Mr. Hines introduces his wife, Linda. She says she's been looking forward to today for weeks now, and that's next to her, that's Maurice Stonefrost, the Director General Chief Executive of the GLC, and his wife, Audrey. Now, as the Queen makes her way down the pontoon towards the Royal Nore.
There she is now, she's casting off, and it will be a pretty speedy journey, as I said, between 10 and 10.5 knots it was planned to be. I think they'll speed up on that. 10.5 knots is about 12 miles an hour. But the Nore's top speed is 20 knots. She's flying the Royal Standard and ranged on each side, as we said, in that colourful costume, the Queen's Waterman. What a magnificent sight as they go towards Waterloo Bridge. Designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, the man who also designed the familiar phone box. A man of many talents. In the background, that magnificent Tower Bridge. The distance between the towers, incidentally, is just about the same as the width of just one Thames barrier gate, which is an impressive pointer, I think, to the scale of the barrier as a whole.
The Thames has always wanted to flood, long before London existed. Left alone, the water would spill out way beyond today's familiar embankments. One of the reasons, the southeast as a whole is tilting downwards by about 12 inches every 100 years, as the north recovers from the weight of a bygone ice age. In addition, London is also sinking on its bed of clay. Archaeologists had to dig deep into the mud at Billingsgate to uncover London's Roman port. They reckon Roman high tide was about 10 feet below today's high water mark. And today's River Thames is much more confined than the Roman River, which was up to 4 times wider at high water. time after time, the river has tried to re-establish its old course. Samuel Pepys wrote about it 2 years before the plague and the fire. The greatest tide that was ever remembered, he wrote. All Whitehall was drowned. And in Victorian London, as the working-class slums crowded down to the riverside, the battle against the tides continued. More and more people suffered in what seemed like a losing struggle. In 1928, a surge tide in a full River Thames burst through banks some 20 feet high. Pavements were shattered, houses destroyed, and 14 people died, most of them in Westminster. Many of them, like the 4 Harding sisters, were trapped in basement bedrooms behind barred windows.
We had no warning. All I knew was that about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a lot of shouting going on. The water was coming up the road, but at that time the basements were already flooded, up to the level of the railings almost, up to the level of the pavements, completely submerged in water.
Dad woke us up and started saying in his excited way, there's a flood, and which didn't mean nothing to me. I didn't know what bloody flood was, I don't think. And me and my brother got our feet out into the side of the bed, and as soon as our toes touched it, we knew there's water there, and it came up to our knees. And that.
The next great surge tide was worse. This time it smashed through sea defences all down the east coast, from Lincolnshire to Kent. More than 300 died. Much of Camvey Island in the Thames was submerged. One of the first out that night, Mike Saunders, a part-time fireman.
It was dark, the water was rushing along, and the first 2 things that hit my leg was 2 babies who had been drowned. They just floated by me.
Also on the scene, Fred McCabe, a local reporter.
A friend of mine, he and his wife lived over in Newlands. The water broke in and washed he and his wife up to the ceiling of their house, and he held her in his arms for a few hours, and then she drifted away into the room and died. Imagine dying in your own living room like that.
Prime Minister Churchill called it a most grievous disaster. 10,000 Canvey Islanders left their homes, the biggest evacuation in peacetime Britain. A national fund was launched. Volunteers and servicemen helped mend the breached sea defences. And among the first to console and encourage, a young Queen Elizabeth. The great puzzle for the early engineers was how to control the tides in the Thames and yet leave enough room for the ships that used the busiest port in the world. Thousands of ships, bringing millions of tons in and out of the still thriving docks and wharves. It was Britain's trade lifeline. Some kind of weir or barrage was out of the question. This one, complete with locks, was planned for Gravesend soon after Queen Victoria died. The river authorities said it would obstruct the traffic. This design for a site at Woolwich almost got as far as a public inquiry in 1938. It was vetoed by the government, who feared it would attract enemy bombers. During the war, London, of course, had other things to worry about. It was the flood despair and devastation in 1953 that once again concentrated the mind. A government committee under Viscount Waverley said a barrier to stop a surge tide was now an urgent priority, and 2 firms of consultants went to work. Among the suggestions, a barrier with gates that dropped from towers 300 feet high, and a barrier with gates that swung on huge piers in the middle of the river. Neither satisfied the Port of London Authority. They wanted a single span of 1,400 feet, wider than the length of the longest ship. In 1962, a surge tide flooded Hamburg in Germany and 300 people died. Had the wind been in a different direction, it could have hit England. Another official report, this time from Sir Herman Bondi, then Professor of Maths at King's College, said a surge tide in London would be a disaster, a knockout blow to the nerve centre of the country. For the engineers, it was back to the drawing board. For a time, they were stumped. Ideas now included gates that rose like flaps at 45 degrees and gates which swung up from the riverbed like drums. A favourite emerged, a high-level barrier with drop gates. The PLA were now happy with a smaller span, the docks were in decline and fewer ships were using the river. The date, 1968. But one of the project engineers at RPT wasn't completely sold on the drop gate method. His name, Charles Draper, and he was convinced there had to be a better way. One day shortly before Christmas that year, Draper was clearing out the garage here at his home in Horsham in West Sussex when he suddenly spotted this, an ordinary domestic gas tap. If a tap like this could be used to halt the flow of gas, he thought, then why not something similar to stop water, or indeed the Thames itself? One glance at the tap's simple mechanism was enough to sow the seed in Charles Draper's mind, a seed that was to germinate first as a simple sketch. This, he wrote at the bottom, could have possibilities. And from the sketch there came a rough working model mocked up out of plywood and string. The rising sector gate had arrived, and with it a viable flood defence system for London.
Archimedes had a word for it, eureka, the moment that Charles Draper found inspiration from that ordinary gas tap, the sort of thing that's in your garage or basement or under the stairs. Soon the men who built it will join this day of celebration. More than 2,000 of them laboured for 10 years down there on the barrier, and who so much wanted a royal opening, and they're waiting now at Woolwich for the ceremony to begin. This was how they did a very complex, difficult and dangerous job.
Building work began on the site at Woolwich in the winter of 1974 and 1975, and the first main job that faced the CTH consortium was among the most difficult of all. They had to build coffer dams in the river, so work could go ahead on the concrete piers that would house the machinery. 8 coffer dams in all, watertight boxes made of interlocking steel plates. Giant hammers pounded the steel into place day and night. They drilled, they dredged 19 metres below the river bed, deep into the flinty chalk. Divers coped in water so black they could only work by touch. When emptied of water, the larger dams were big enough to hold 400 double-decker buses. Inside each of them, the concrete piers would begin to take shape. On the north bank, the concrete sills were taking shape too, inside their specially built dry dock. Precast units strengthened with steel. With each of them, 2 parallel service tunnels, destined to carry power cables and provide walkways beneath the river. June 1978. The lowering of the first sill. It was floated into position and then sunk deep on the river bed between the piers. It wasn't an inch perfect operation, it was millimetre perfect. Autumn 1982. HMS Belfast passed through on her way to Tilbury for repairs. After 8 years, the barrier was ready for its first full test.
And that first test was only a few months in coming. It was a night in February 1983 when a flood tide threatened. It wasn't one of the biggest the Thames has seen, but big enough to prove that the builders had done their job well. The barrier stood the test. And now, from the barrier, we can see the Royal Nore on her last leg of the journey to the barrier. It'll be another 5 minutes, I suppose, before the Nore actually reaches the barrier itself, so there's time to join Jack Scott, who keeps his own watchful eye on the weather for us, to explain when and in what circumstances the barrier will be used in deadly earnest to save London.
Out in the Atlantic, one of those all too familiar depressions, a deep, low-pressure system circled by high winds, and it's moving towards the north of Scotland. Underneath those clouds, the sea level is already higher than normal. The low pressure alone draws it up. But it's those winds circling the depression which pose the real danger. As the weather system moves now towards Denmark, the winds are blowing straight down the North Sea. Wind drag on the sea surface builds up the waves and pulls in vast quantities of water from the Atlantic. Now we're seeing the start of a classic North Sea surge. Massive amounts of water being driven down south. And as the North Sea narrows, it acts like a giant funnel, building the water up even higher. And the Earth's rotation draws that water towards the east coast. And there, wide and gaping, is the mouth of the Thames ready to swallow it. Now, if all this happened at the time of a spring tide, and when the river was already swollen by rain, that wall of water would funnel straight to the heart of London and swamp it. That may sound dramatic, but now that we can forecast the danger and we have the barrier to protect us, it will never, ever happen again.
That's through the barriers. There you see the huge discs that bring the massive rising sector gates up from the riverbed, and the yellow rocker arms above, and the stainless steel cowlings of the piers have been described as looking a little like Sydney Opera House, and you can see why. There's always a very stiff breeze blowing down on this part of the river, and as I said, when it rains, it doesn't rain vertically, it rains horizontally. Now we're waiting for Her Majesty to come off the Roll-Nor for the first presentations. And Baroness Phillips, the Lord Lieutenant of Greater London, is the Queen's representative in the 32 boroughs. She's held that office for 6 years now. Baroness Phillips will present Councillor Jeff Jeffrey, the Mayor of Greenwich, his wife, Kathleen Jeffrey, Councillor Bert Philpott, he's from Newham, Mayor of Newham. Councillor Philpott has met the Queen before. His wife, Margaret Philpott, John Cartwright, the local SDP MP for Woolwich, and then Nigel Spearing, the Labour MP for the area, and Commander Anthony Newman, meeting the Queen for the first time. He's the man in charge of policing the local area, including the barrier. Security, of course, here very important. And Peter Sargent, who's the owner of the pier, and he incidentally built it as well. So a big day for him. And this is going to be Ken Livingstone's first meeting with the Queen, exactly 3 years to the day, by chance, after he took office as leader of the Greater London Council. Here's the meeting. Yes, he has bowed. He said he would.
And the Royal Party are about to meet the people who had overall charge and responsibility for the design and building of this great barrier. See all the flags waving? Really is a great atmosphere. Coming now to some more presentations, and first in line, Peter Jones, the GLC Director of Architecture. His department designed those stainless steel domes. John Holloway, the acting project manager. Third in line, Brian Trafford from the Ministry of Agriculture again. They had to be satisfied that the barrier would work before they gave it the go-ahead. Peter Cox, the senior partner of RPT, Rendell Palmer and Tritton, the firm whose engineer Charles Draper came up with the idea of the rising sector gates. Next to John Reeve, chairman of Costains, and the consortium of companies who built the barrier, known as CTH. And he first met the Queen at the opening of the Humber Bridge, which his company was also involved in. John Fletcher, chairman of the Davy Cleveland Barrier Consortium, who built the gates for the barrier on Teesside. So all those men playing key roles in the building of this barrier, which took around 8 years, with 1 or 2 stoppages here and there. Moving on now to the dais.
Now we're waiting for Her Majesty to go to the dais, where we'll hear those short speeches from Mr. Harvey Hines, the chairman of the GLC, and then the Queen herself, before she presses a button to activate the barrier. And those huge gates will start to rise up from the riverbed.
And as the cheers of the crowds here ring in your ears,
Waiting, and first to speak will be Mr. Harvey Hines, the chairman of the Greater London.
Your Majesty will know that throughout its 2,000-year history, London has been at risk from tidal flooding. Your Majesty, in January 1968, Parliament, with that knowledge, charged the Greater London Council with the responsibility for investigating the long-term flood defences of London. Your Majesty, many individuals, businesses and organizations have supported the Council in its endeavors, including financial support from central government and the work and skills of people from all over the United Kingdom and, let me add, from Holland. The Council therefore wishes to give pride of place on this great day to the 3,000 or more people in those organizations, public and private, who, working together, made this barrier possible by their skills, their commitment and their efforts. On their behalf, we commend our joint efforts to Your Majesty and invite you to declare the Greater London Council's Thames Barrier and all its associated works operational.
Mr. Chairman, it is a great tribute to the wisdom of Parliament and of successive governments and to the unswerving purpose of the Greater London Council that London has now been made free from the threat of flooding. But while today we look upon this marvel of modern engineering, it is important to remember that for many a year no one thought it would be possible to stem the tidal flood of the Thames. Yet, thanks to a combination of foresight and tenacity, the power of the great river flowing through our capital has been tamed. The successful completion of this enterprise has been a remarkable example of ingenuity and engineering skill, and the Thames Barrier is regarded as one of the engineering wonders of the world. I am very proud that it was conceived, designed and built by British engineers, and that most of the barrier has been produced by British industry, demonstrating a number of new British technological developments which will be of great value throughout the world. Mr. Chairman, this is a good day for Britain. A tremendous engineering project has been successfully accomplished. Parliament, Government and Greater London Council can be well pleased. I want to congratulate all those responsible for this great feat, for they have made a vital contribution to the safety of London. I have much pleasure in declaring the Thames Barrier operational.
Indeed, now meeting the Queen, many of the top men from companies involved in the building of the barrier. Costains employ 21,000 people. They're a worldwide company with projects in more than 50 countries. And more familiar sites to their credit include the runways at Gatwick and Heathrow airports, parts of the M25 motorway and the Humber Bridge.
Now we can give you a glimpse of what's going on now inside those piers, the inner workings of this massive construction. Before the rising sector gates can be raised, they have to be unlocked. So the first things that move are the latches which hold the gates secure. Once they're off, the hydraulics do the rest. The power units which drive them are housed underneath the big domes. Inside, they're lined with pine, quite a contrast to their stainless steel exteriors. The power packs drive oil to hydraulic rams below, which move the yellow rocker beams you saw attached to the circular gate arms, rotating them through 90 degrees.